It's a nice room. Y'all gonna have to bear with me. LA is the only place in the world. I flew in from Singapore this morning and got here on time and then still got here late trying to get through traffic. It's ridiculous, this city. But I live in New York, so I can't talk that much. How y'all doing? Yeah, how's the conference been? Good? Okay. So, I feel like I don't have to give a ton of background information. I got some things to say today, so I'm just going to jump in. How about that? All right. It's been a long year. Yeah, see, I got my sneakers on. I've become a new person this year. I don't even care no more. I ain't got no I'm not putting on no heels. Y'all gonna get these sneakers and this dress, and we're gonna talk about some things. Because we're in a serious moment. I mean, all jokes aside. Despite what you might have read about Me Too, the Me Too movement and how it was founded, you should know this. It was not and never has been about just raising awareness. It's not about just creating solidarity among survivors, and it's not about targeting perpetrators. And the moment that we're in right now is about, unfortunately, undoing so many of the misconceptions that are out here and undoing some of the bad information that has persisted over the last year. The Me Too movement was founded as a means to help survivors of sexual violence find resources for healing. And we also started to empower survivors to combat sexual violence in our own communities on our own terms. So I'm gonna back up a little bit and talk a little bit about myself, only in relation to this. And I usually don't, because I'm actually feeling like survivors are having to do a little bit too much labor lately. But I am a survivor of sexual violence, and I didn't always identify that way. In the last year, people ask me all the time about how Me Too got started. And because it's an odd question for me that I didn't answer for these last 15 years that I've been doing the work, I always think of it in very clear terms about the year and the date and the time and when we incorporated and what our first programs were, around 2005, 2006. But something that I realized when I was watching the Supreme Court hearings, when Dr. Blasey Ford was testifying, one of the things I realized about what's happening right now in this country, and it doesn't fall along partisan lines, is that people really don't understand the life cycle of a survivor. People don't understand what it means to survive. We use the word all the time now, when we have always used it as a way to replace victim, because we want survivors not to feel like victims, but to feel like they survived something. But I think in doing that, for some people who don't know this experience, it has erased the reality that so many of us get up and decide to survive every day. It's a task, it's a chore, it's work that we put in on a regular basis. And a year ago, millions and millions of people raised their hands in that work, in that labor, to say that their lives have been touched by sexual violence. Not yesterday, not last week for many of them, but at some point in their life, at some point in their journey. And they have been holding that thing inside of their bodies for however many years until this moment allowed them to be free. Just to say the words. And so I think it's important to know that this is not just about being political. It's not just about capturing a moment. It's about restoring the humanity of individual people. When I was a little girl, my mother loves literature and really wrapped me in Black feminist literature my whole life. And so in our house, she has all these bookcases. And when I was a little girl, she had all of Maya Angelou's books. I mean, we had a lot of Toni Morrison and every Black, author you can think of, and Ntozake Shange, just everybody. But Maya Angelou's books caught my eye because they were really colorful. If you've ever seen her first editions, they're like these really colorful covers, and they have these really interesting names. So Imagine being like 11 or 12, and there were names like Singing and Swinging and Getting Merry Like Christmas. And I know why the cage bird sings. And so I remember asking my mother over and over again, Mommy, can I read this book? I wanted to read Cage Bird. And she would say, you're not ready for that. It's a little too mature for you. And then finally one time, I don't know, I was maybe about 11 or 12, and I snuck the book off the shelf and started reading it. It wasn't very long. And I read it in my room, and I got to the part in the book where, if you don't know this, this is a part of Maya Angelou's life. Many people know this, but I got to the part in the book where she talks about being sexually assaulted at 7 years old. And my heart stopped, because I had never seen or heard or read anything else in my life about a child like me who was assaulted, ever. I knew it was wrong, but I felt so guilty about it, I hadn't associated it with something being done to me. But when I read it in the book, I felt so sorry for her. And so I remember feeling like me and Maya Angelou had a secret. Just the two of us. I finally found somebody else who knew what this thing felt like. Of course, Maya Angelou didn't speak for several years. I tried that, it wasn't really successful. It's not my thing. But I felt a kinship with her. So a few years later, I'm in high school, 10th grade. My high school honors English teacher says, we're gonna read about Maya Angelou. So by now, I'm kind of obsessed with her, right? I'd read all her stuff, I knew her life story, I knew her poetry, but I had never heard her voice. It just wasn't the same as it is now, when you have videos everywhere and you see it on TV all the time. I'd never heard her actual voice. And my teacher played Phenomenal Woman in the classroom, and I heard her voice, and I listened to her read that poem, and I was so confused. I can remember the feeling I had in my body of just going from feeling like elated that we were talking about this person who I love so much to not understanding what was happening, because every word that came out of her mouth, I believed it. I believed that she was a phenomenal woman, and I couldn't understand it because I knew the kind of pain that she had gone through because I had gone through it. And I thought we had a secret. So I went home that night, and I wrote in my journal, because I was this kind of kid. I wrote my thesis question. Remember we had to do that when you was little, when you were younger? The kids nowadays don't know about language arts. But we remember those days. You had to write your thesis at the top. And I really wrote in my journal, thesis. It's my main idea. Because I was so curious. I needed to know how a person who had so much pain could also have joy. What was her secret? Was it authentic? I was so curious to find out how she had either gotten over this thing or had learned to pretend so well that she could fool everybody. Because that's what I took away from the experience in the book. I thought, oh, okay, I just have to be the best at everything so nobody understands who I really am, that I'm really this kind of girl. And eventually, focusing on that question became too hard. It became too hard. I was a teenager. I didn't understand it. I didn't want to deal with these feelings, so I tucked it away. I became an organizer at 14 years old. I started doing social justice work in New York, and eventually I went to school in Alabama and continued that work. When I finished school, I went to go work for the organization that I had been a member of since high school. It's called the 21st Century Youth Leadership Movement. The 21st Century is started in 1985, but it was founded by veterans of the civil rights and Black power and labor movements of the 60s and 70s, by people who wanted to make sure young people carried on their legacy. So I was a part of 21st Century, and I was very excited about that, and it gave me a place to direct all of this energy I had. But even in the work that I did in 21st Century, we organized around racial justice and around economic justice, and we had rallies around police brutality, and we demonstrated around everything, but we never even talked about gender-based violence. We never even talked about things that touched the lives of the girls in our program. Not to say that this doesn't touch the lives of everybody, but specific to what I was feeling at the time. But I didn't question it until I finished school and I went to work for 21st Century and I met a girl, a young girl who I call Heaven publicly. Heaven was, in the South we call her a hellion. Y'all know what that is? Yeah, she was a hellion. She was much like myself as a child. a lot of mouth, a lot of attitude, very smart, very quick-witted, very mean when she wanted to be. So I kept her close to me. I kept trying to keep Heaven out of trouble. I would look for her in the morning and kind of carry her with me and give her chores to do. You know, you try to keep young people busy, keep their hands out of stuff. So we got close really fast. And every year in our camp, this is our leadership camp that she was attending, we would have a session we called Sister to Sister, where we let the girls kind of separate and talk about anything that was affecting them, anything that happened in their lives. And oftentimes it was about, you know, boys and so-and-so likes me or so-and-so doesn't like me, or little squabbles with their girlfriends. But at some point in the day or in the evening, the conversation would always turn, and this happened year after year, even when I was a young person. The conversation would turn to sexual violence, because at some point, one of these girls would reveal her own experience with it. And, you know, over the years, we got really good at having a counselor in the room and talking through it, and it was really great. And it was a good experience for the young people. But this year, when Heaven came, I watched her. I watched her watch the other girls. I watched her try to figure out how to insert herself in the conversation. I watched her. I could see the wheels turning in her head, all these little decisions she was making. She never said anything. She never told her story. She never contributed. But the next day, she made a beeline for me. She's like, "Miss Tarana, I need to talk to you. Miss Tarana," you know, just like hounding me. Now remember, I keep this kid with me everywhere I go, so it was very unusual for me to avoid her, but that's exactly what I did. I avoided her like the plague, because I knew. At some point in the afternoon, she cornered me, literally, and said, "Miss Tarana, I need to talk to you, Miss T." I said, "Okay." And I stood there feeling like I was holding my breath, waiting for what I knew was coming. And she just opened up and started telling me about all these things that had happened to her at the hands of her mother's boyfriend. And the reality of her life smacked me dead in the face. It ran right up to the reality of my life. And I shut her down. In my brain, I'm thinking, I don't know what to say. You know, I'm like, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a counselor. I don't want to say the wrong thing. You know, if you have kids or you work with kids or you know, just love children in any kind of way, the one thing you don't want to do is mess a child up. You don't want to be responsible for saying the thing that's going to like change their whole life, the wrong thing. I didn't want to say the wrong thing. And intellectually, all of these things kept coming in my brain, and like, I don't know how to handle this, but in my heart, what I really wanted to say was, this happened to me too. This thing that you're describing, this pain I see in your eyes, I know it because it happened to me too. I wanted to be her Maya Angelou, but I didn't have it. So I shut her down and I sent her away to another counselor. And I felt terrible. But as bad as I felt, I didn't stop myself because I didn't know what to do. When I gathered myself, and that sat with me for a long time, the decision I made was that I knew I had to revisit that question that I had asked myself in high school. I had to start doing my own work because at this point I had made a commitment to these young people to be in their lives, to be a part of the solutions in their lives. And I could not do my own work if it meant leaving them the way I left Heaven. So I started doing that work. I'm still doing that work. But these girls mattered to me. When we started Me Too, It was simply because these young people in the community where I was working needed somebody to speak healing into their lives. They needed somebody to say that it was possible, even if it's a lifelong journey. They needed somebody to say, you're not the sum total of the things that happen to you. It's not your fault. You're not complicit, you're not dirty, you're not wrong, and you're not a victim. That's the same thing people are asking for today. There's no difference between the 7th and 8th grade girls in Selma, Alabama who sat in our workshops and the millions and millions of people who raised their hand to say Me Too last year. There's very little difference. The fact that our conversation has turned into what it has turned into is so disheartening. We're at a critical moment in this country where we can make a difference. We can actually change the trajectory of what sexual violence looks like, not in this country, but in the world. It boggles my mind how we can watch people labor and tell their stories. And I'm gonna tell you, I say labor, I use that word very intentionally because it is labor. It is labor. I think about the people who, we think about a hashtag. I think about the people who sat in front of their computers watching the hashtag go viral and thinking, should I say it? What if I write it and my mother sees it? What will my coworkers think? What if nobody likes it? The people who watch the computer with tears in their eyes, reading stories about people who had experiences just like them, who they probably sat next to every day and never knew it. It takes a lot to tell your story. It takes a lot to use the hashtag. It takes a lot to raise your hand and be counted in this number because none of us want to be counted in this number. None of us want to talk about it. None of us want to hold it. None of us want to really deal with it, but we have to. That's the labor. And if we have to labor in the ways that we are laboring by using our stories, by putting our bodies, our emotional, physical, and mental well-being on the line, how dare you reduce this to political warfare? Every day I hear more and more things about Me Too being a witch hunt. We're trying to do away with due process. It's wrong. All of those things are wrong. Those are narratives that are created by the media, that are created by politicians. It's wrong. Millions. Do y'all know that more than 12 million people engaged with the Me Too hashtag on Facebook in the first 24 hours? In the first 24 hours. Can you imagine waking up tomorrow, 24 hours from now, and 12 million people suddenly woke up with a rare disease? Not so rare because now 12 million people say, yeah, I have this thing. Spread like wildfire across the world. What would we do? There would only be 3 questions. How did this happen? How do we stop it? How do we make sure it never happens again? We're not asking those questions about sexual violence in this moment. And if we're not asking those questions and we're entertaining anything else, then we're doing the wrong thing. These little talks go so fast. I got 1 minute and 30 minutes, but I'm gonna take a little bit more time. My good girlfriend is I think, one of the foremost thinkers in this country at this moment as well. Her name is Dr. Imani Perry. If you don't know her, you should look her up. She's brilliant. She has a quote that I use very often, and it is, awareness in and of itself is not a virtue without a moral imperative. This is our moral imperative. We need to be clear that we are talking about people's lives. People's lives. It's not about men and women. It's not about how you identify. It's not about any demographic that you can come up specifically. because sexual violence does not discriminate. I was so naive to think that this would be an issue that nobody would argue over. I know, I've learned a lot. But I know that the response to sexual violence is very different than the violence itself. It doesn't discriminate, but who gets left out? It doesn't discriminate, but who do we discriminate against? Whose stories are not being told? Who's not being centered? What's not being talked about? And what role are you playing in that? I just want to leave you with a couple of things. One, if you want to figure out what you can do to help this movement, you can leave this space today and talk about it differently. I need you to carry the message with you when you leave this room, when you go to Thanksgiving in a couple of weeks, you're gonna have, Pop and John and whoever gonna sit down and they like to argue about stuff and they start talking about, oh, that Me Too movement is getting on my nerves, or your Auntie Carol, who's always ornery, say, the one who's like, those women need to close their legs, they need to stop complaining. Don't let those things slip by. We need to have hard conversations with our families, with our friends, with our coworkers. That guy, fellas, who was always telling crude jokes, the one who you watch make women uncomfortable in your job, don't laugh at him. Don't laugh at his jokes. We have to be different. If we want to see difference, we have to be different. There are some of us who are warriors. We're going to be on the ground, on the front lines, fighting to end sexual violence with our entire being until we take our last breath. You don't have to be that person. You can make our lives easier by just doing small things. Talk about this movement differently. Don't let people define what it is. Don't let people tell you that you're left out, and don't opt yourself out. The other thing I hear more than just as much as I hear about the misconceptions is about who Me Too is not talking about. Be clear. If you define the Me Too movement by what CNN tells you or the White House tells you, then you will all be left out, unless you are white, male, rich, and accused. We cannot leave it up to the people who don't care about us and who have never centered our needs to tell our stories, to validate this as a movement. We validate this as a movement. It's your movement if you say it is. You're in it if you say you are. Don't opt yourself out because you don't see yourself on the nightly news, because your stories are not being told, because people aren't centering you. I cannot believe that in a year's time, there has not been one. And if I'm wrong, somebody can prove me wrong. But I have not seen one mainstream media expose. We got exposés on perpetrators. But where's the 5-part series on sexual violence in America, taking a deep look at why 12 million people can respond to a hashtag in a day? We haven't seen that. That tells me something about the moral fabric of our society. I don't want to start preaching. But it really is a morality issue, because what this comes down to at the end of the day is humanity. It's about humanity. This is about the way power and privilege chips away, the misuse of power and privilege chips away at humanity. We're not asking for a lot. We're asking to walk through life with our full dignity intact, as fully actualized human beings. That's not a lot to ask. That's an inalienable right. Everybody has a role to play in that, whether it's you helping to keep somebody's humanity intact, standing up for somebody's humanity and dignity, talking about this in a way that restores people's humanity and dignity. We can all play a part in this movement. You can all be a part of this movement. You have to make that decision. I'm asking you to make that decision. I'm asking you to help us elevate this work from where it is now, because we are in a unique historical moment. I don't know how long we'll have it, But while we have it, we have to run with it. And it's not about a singular person. This is not about what Tarana Burke does next. It's about what we do next with this moment. Thank you.